A few months ago, Brass Facts made a video about the Roland Special and its place in the perpetually evolving gun meta. While I wasn't familiar with the Roland at the time, I had already come to the same conclusions as its creator, Chuck Pressburg, and had long been practicing the civilian offensive handgun concept myself. That concept, which Brock made a follow-up video on, is essentially that in cases where carrying a full long gun is not possible, one should select the most overwhelmingly capable pistol that it is still possible to conceal. This means accepting higher cost, size, and weight in exchange for greater combat performance, and in most cases, such as the original Roland Special, this also means compromising reliability. The more you modify about a gun, the more particular it tends to get with ammo selection and maintenance. But my thinking was, what if you started with one of the most absurdly reliable and accurate handguns ever made? One that was designed as the original offensive handgun for the military, and one that they are still producing and selling to civilians, and can be updated with several of the good developments of the last couple decades to incorporate those. So, with the extremely generous help of my brother Austin, I acquired a Mark 23 for daily concealed carry, and with the wisdom of him and my buddies Matt and August, who's got his own Roland Special setup, I gradually brought it to the point it is now to share for your consideration. Basically, I'm making this video as a resource for anyone who is in the position I was several years ago. I was interested in the Mark 23 for this purpose for well over a decade and found virtually no information or wisdom from others online who were carrying them. This is the video that I wish existed before I started. This isn't going to be going over the history of the gun or its purpose. If you're here, I assume you know what this is. If you are interested in all that, I recommend Forgotten Weapons and 1911 Syndicate's videos about the development of the Mark 23, especially the latter, which features one of the SEALs involved in the famous testing and which addresses that pernicious FUD lore that they were never actually used and just gathered dust in SOCOM armories. By necessity, there will be certain elements of a review here, but this is not a review. Those already exist by people with more qualifications and higher round counts than me, and I'm trying to address a very specific vacuum of information, because from what I've seen, virtually all civilian ownership of the Mark 23 falls into one of at least four categories: interest in it as a military history oddity, a range toy, a collector's piece, or they really liked using it in a video game, probably Metal Gear Solid, and then wanted one for themselves. All of which are perfectly valid reasons to get a gun, but in each case, it generally winds up as a safe queen, and others don't use it in a practical civilian context. But I do, and so I wanted to pass on my findings. First, what I've modified about it. I will link the various products and services in the video description for those interested. This is an Acro P2, a red dot sight from Aimpoint with a reputation kind of similar to the Mark 23 itself. It's bulky, it's reliable, it's costly. You would think it would be a perfect match. However, I was not originally planning on doing this. I had never used a pistol red dot before I got this gun, and I was reluctant to make any permanent changes to my holy grail pistol, especially something as drastic as milling out the slide. Besides, the irons are fantastic. The first time I went shooting, I punched out the center of the target at 10 yards and then got a pretty respectable hand-sized group at 25 yards. And I'd only get better with practice, so why jump on this growing red dot sight meta? Well, I got shown up. I went shooting with some buddies up north, Austin and Matt, who I mentioned at the beginning, and we took it out to 120 yards with our handguns. I had my $2,000 Navy SEAL gun with iron sights, and they had their budget SIG 320s with hollow suns. They were getting hits on steel within 5 rounds, and I was well into my second magazine. Admittedly, I didn't have the extension then, before I got a single confirmed hit. Well, this might have been a skill issue. At that distance, I was completely obscuring the target with my sights and slide. With a red dot, you can still keep the target in the window when you need to aim high to account for bullet drop, especially with a subsonic round like 45 ACP. So this got me thinking. Accuracy was a major part of why I got this gun in the first place. Am I not wasting it and violating the whole philosophy that drew me to the Mark 23 by turning down a superior optic solution for the sake of keeping the gun vanilla? Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. So, I humbled myself a little bit and started looking into pistol red dots. I got the wisdom of much more knowledgeable friends. Again, Austin, Matt, August all came into play, and they pointed me to Sage Dynamics green paper and testing. The Acro P2 was relatively new at the time and looked promising from that research, and I happily found a service to mill and mount it, which I'll link, so I went with that. I tell you all this because this video is primarily just meant as data for those interested in the Mark 23 in the way that I was. I'm not trying to convince you of anything in particular, even getting this, if you don't already want it. I'm just showing you what I've done and how it's worked for me, but this point is the exception. This is a recommendation. If you get a Mark 23 for anything practical and can spare the cash, please go for the red dot. Let my experience spare you the time spent with just irons. I have had zero problems with this whole arrangement. The Acro has held zero. I've yet to replace the batteries, which I think boast 5 years of active life on medium settings. The mounting is extremely firm, and it has not budged a bit through all my shooting and racking off of it. I'm not entirely sure what this is from, honestly. I've never dropped it on anything harder than carpet, and aside from tripping a few times with it in a chest rig, I've never encountered anything notable that would scrape the corners like that. I think it's the repeated action of drawing and replacing it in my backpack over the years. Same as the finish on the slide, but I'm going to get to that later. So an unexpected blessing about the red dot option is that because the 23 has suppressor height sights, because it was made to shoot with a suppressor, they're still completely visible in the window. I'll throw up a picture or clip here. So even if you're concerned about the reliability of a red dot, you are not sacrificing your irons to do so. The battery could die, the glass could shatter, and you've still got the excellent irons to be looking through. And if you do go the suppressor route, you won't be as constrained on outer diameter with the irons as your limiting factor. Now you've got the red dot as a higher sight picture. So as far as I can tell from my research, the original Knights armament suppressor for the Mark 23 was 1 3/8 inch outer diameter. Now you could push it out to the more common 1.5 inch with a modern can and have a really clear sight picture through the red dot. And just, you know, as Garantham said when he was drop testing this thing,
this is the only gun that the Acro looks good on.
Yo, it actually does look pretty good on that gun.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Okay, here we go. She's good.
I rest my case. Moving on, the extended magazine from HK Parts. You can order the extension alone and then put it on the stock mags that come with the gun. You're not buying a whole new third-party mag. These are the factory AK mags, or order a fresh mag with it already on. I've had zero issue shooting with it outside the very first mag because it wasn't assembled correctly. That's a big thing to make sure of. If the base plate is not properly seated, it can catch the spring when it's fully loaded. Notably, getting the final 17th round in here, this is 12 plus 5, is extraordinarily difficult. And when you've got it loaded, and when you've got that number 17 in there, which is still quite doable, and you try to insert it on a closed magazine, that right there almost feels like I'm crimping the top of the round. That is too tight of a fit for me to be comfortable with. For this reason and just general reliability, even the mag catch was hard to do. I'd really only recommend loading 16 and just treating this as a 12 plus 4 extension instead of a plus 5, if you go for it. The green O-ring you can see poking up out there. I bought this gun very gently used. Remember my comment about how they tend to be safe queens? And it came without the barrel thread O-ring protecting it. The thread protector, this guy, kept walking off whenever I was shooting. I didn't even realize it was supposed to have an O-ring on the threads until mentioning how annoying this was on a forum, and someone finally told me. Fortunately, HK Parts, which also sells the magazine extension, sells replacements for $5. You do have to remove it each time when you field strip the gun. The barrel won't come out unless you do, and so I see why it was lost. Someone disassembled it and forgot to put it back on. So HK has this just awful proprietary rail on their guns from the era, which is my only complaint about the factory gun. And so if you want to mount a modern light or laser, you need an adapter. I found two options. Both are painfully expensive. One is ugly and obtrusive from HK Parts, but a bit cheaper than the much superior Lobos adapter, which is what I've got on here right now. These were out of stock when I first wanted one, so if you do want to use a light and want to get the MK23, I'd get on the watch list as soon as you're sure of that decision. I'd imagine the market is really small on these, and they make runs only when the watch list gets big enough that they'll have buyers. It's very well made, very solid, doesn't completely ruin the lines of the gun like the big bulky HK one. I'm sure I'll throw up a picture of it here, and you'll appreciate how much better this little thing is. My only complaint is that the bright stainless steel screw is kind of ugly, but you will not be seeing it all that much once your light is on. I put a Streamlight TLR H1 on mine, nothing much to stay there. It's a light that does light things. My primary concern when selecting a light was holster compatibility, which brings us to the holster. Funny enough, this was the final thing that I got for this project a week ago today. I had been drafting this video for a really long time, but I thought the whole thing seemed incomplete until I had a holster. For the first couple of years, I was just carrying in my waistband and had zero problems with that. There is so much flat surface area on this gun that it just stayed put comfortably. Which, by the way, should be really encouraging to anyone interested in this whole idea. If I can comfortably carry this with an ordinary leather belt, no holster, and under a t-shirt in South Texas summer, you can make it work with a proper gun belt, a holster, and a jacket in more temperate conditions. In practice, I've found small of the back or 5 o'clock to be the best with or without a holster, but sitting comfortably for long periods just has not happened with the holster in any configuration. Again, I've only had it for a week. Maybe I'll get better at using it and figure out a proper way to put it. Anyway, since, as previously stated, no one concealed carries this gun, so mass-produced IWB Mark 23 holsters are just not a thing, especially with options to accommodate all the changes that I've made, red dot light, rail. So, again, Mexican carry works great, but if you insist on a holster, you need to go custom. Litton Custom Holsters offers IWB Mark 23 holsters for under $100 and not only accommodates red dots and lights, but specifically has an option for the Lobos rail adapter. Great service, can't recommend it enough. The guy even texted me, it's one dude, asking for a picture to make sure he understood, like, he had everything right for my order form. And as you can see, it fits like a glove. It even stays in with gravity. You can see that is a good fit. Let me make absolutely certain that was, yeah, I think that should be still in frame. You can see it's not coming out. Good product. Amazing find. Thank you, August, for discovering this, and thank you, Justin Litton, for providing it. Personally, I regard everything except the red dot to be optional. This is the only strictly necessary thing in order to make this work, in my opinion. If you save money on the rail and the light and the extension and the holster and put it towards an Acro, I think that would be a prudent choice compared to just keeping it irons. So, onto the gun itself. This is where I'm going to step a little into review territory. The short version is that the 23's reputation is completely well earned and all the hype is true. It is insanely reliable. I have not kept a precise round count, but I guess I've put between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds through it at this point. Not counting that one incident with the mag extension being assembled incorrectly, I've only had 3 failures to feed when shooting, and 2 were right next to each other when I was limp wristing it on a bench, just going like this, trying to get a really precise shot at a distance. No resistance whatsoever. And the third was a single failure to cycle when I was shooting normally, but I was plinking with some cheap reman ammo, remanufactured. So, to state the same thing differently, I've had 0 malfunctions when using even standard pressure factory ammo and anything resembling proper grip, even after adding mass to the slide with the Acro, which should interfere with reliability. I have never had a gun with less problems. Everything about it just works. Speaking of ammo, the 23 is way over-engineered to use +P+ without heavy wear. Nothing you can put through this is ever going to hurt it. As I carried, I moved from standard pressure 45 ball up to Hornady Hornady +P hollow points to what I'm currently sitting at, which is Underwood 45 Super. For some context, standard 45 ACP ball ammunition is just a plain 230 grain slug going at about 800 feet per second, well below the speed of sound, so there's no sonic boom to this. When you get into overpressured rounds, you start seeing a spread of how you want to apply that energy. There's some 45 Supers that boast a lighter 185 grain FMJ going at 1500 feet per second, almost twice the speed, but I've stuck with the 230 grain hollow point, but going at 1100 feet per second. For an easy comparison, that's about the same muzzle velocity as the most common 9mm rounds, but double the mass. This is going as fast as a normal 9mm, but it's twice as heavy, and as a hollow point. I think that's pretty cool. I think the size of the Mark 23 has actually been extremely over-exaggerated by its reputation. I have larger than average hands. I'm not Andre the Giant. When you're actually holding it, it doesn't feel like a gimmick gun. This is not a 500 Smith & Wesson that you shoot one time for the novelty and then regret. It feels like a normal gun. I repeat, it feels like a normal gun that is just big. To get on my soapbox for a moment, I suspect the shift to compacts and subcompacts and even micro compacts as the common carry gun has altered kind of the general perception of what a normal pistol size is. You know, there was a time when we thought Colt single action armies, that's what a pistol size is, 1911s, Beretta M9s. But that's outside the scope of this video. If concerns about the ergonomics are what's preventing you from going for one, I'd actually recommend getting an airsoft version and seeing if you like that. There's this $20 spring version I had as a kid that surprisingly prepared me for the real thing pretty well in terms of grip and sight picture and weapon manipulation. The first time I held the true version, the only thing I was surprised about from, a childhood of playing with the airsoft version was the weight disparity between the slide and the frame. I was coming from an all-steel EDC, time for the Jericho to make its appearance. So the center of gravity was very centralized because the whole thing was made of basically the same material. And on the Mark 23, the frame is made of some Teutonic, elvish polymer that is, I think, maybe even lighter than the airsoft gun's frame. Whereas, conversely, the slide is like a bank vault door. You can even just hear, oh, that feels every bit as solid as it sounds, like a bank vault door closing. When loaded, it doesn't feel that off balance, but a huge part, it does without anything in the magazine. So there's a big weight disparity between it. But the ergonomics overall work when the gun is loaded. It's only when you have this ultralight frame and this ultra heavy slide without it, especially with the red dot and light and everything I've added to it. Ergonomics work when it's loaded. The extended magazine also distributes the weight just a little more centrally because you've got more coming down off the gun. Extreme mechanical accuracy aside, which I assume you know about if you're here and you know about the Mark 23, I find it really pointable because of how much mass there is out here on the slide. If I just instinctively say I want to shoot there, it just goes where I want, which is really good about getting a flash sight picture. That red dot is in the window. There's some practice to it, but I don't have to hunt for the dot because of how easily the slide just helps me guide to where I want to go. And to be clear about the ergonomics and side stuff, I would not recommend all this to men with small hands or frames or any women. Concealing one comfortably definitely requires you to be a larger than average man. I'm just saying you don't need to be a statistical anomaly to do so. It's easy, secure, and comfortable for me even with those self-imposed handicaps of a normal belt, no holster, and light clothing. So the single action trigger that we're unloaded is fantastic. There's a short, easy take-up with a very crisp wall. It's way better than any striker I've ever used and solidly better than most hammer guns like my Jericho. Just not quite like 1911 level. By contrast, the double action trigger is just egregious. I have not heard anyone talk about this online, and I don't have a trigger gauge, but there's a video of a guy testing one and it caps out at 12 pounds before the trigger even starts moving. So it's at least that much. And if you told me that was 20 pounds or more, I wouldn't be totally surprised. The pull itself is smooth and heavy, but there's no clear wall. In practice, it means that the double action trigger is a very effective safety. If you don't want to deal with toggling a manual safety on the draw and keep the process as simple as possible, that's very safe to do here. And you can always cock the hammer back for a precise first shot if you have the time for it. Regarding the decocker, one of the more special things about it, one thing that surprised me was how light the take-up is. You can see I can just, with the tip of my finger, it doesn't require much pressure. It takes up really easily, but then suddenly the weight of the hammer is put on the decocker, and if you're not really pushing down on it, it jumps out from under your finger and makes a loud noise. So silent decocker requires that you keep your thumb on it. Oh, see, there you go. It jumped out. This is not my normal shooting grip. And then you got to release off of it. Speaking of which, and carry conditions, because it's got the decocker, which is much nicer than having to put your finger on the trigger and risk having an ND, you can indeed, we're chambering around now. Right now, we're in condition 1. We've got a round in the chamber, hammer back, safety on, but I can take the safety off and use the decocker, and now it's in double action. Now I have a really long, hard trigger pull, and the gun will go off. That's a nice way to carry. I have carried this gun in conditions 1, 2, and 3. All of them work just fine, and I've never had any particular problems with it. For those interested in carrying at condition 3, I have found that it's very easy to manage the slide because there's so much surface area, there's not much to slip, the grooves are there, and especially importantly, you can rack off the red dot because it's mounted so well extremely easily. You can even do it with just your hand. To demonstrate. It's not hard. Very easy slide to rack, not like a little M&P shield. That's a terrible gun to carry condition 3 because of how hard the slide is. To move around, the paddle magazine is extremely positive in how it ejects out. It's not just, it almost feels like it's not just a release, It's like an ejector almost. You can see it's a flat angle how hard it's pushing that out. I've never had an issue with getting empties out of the gun. When I'm reloading, they just come out and the next one goes in. Very smooth. Anyone who doesn't like the HK paddle ejector is just wrong. Oh, I mentioned how the Acro, the coating was coming off on the corners, and here on the slide as well. That's happened very gradually. I've compared some pictures of when I first got it, because of course I took pictures right away, and you can see that there's been wear from all the drawing. Personally, it doesn't bother me, and I think it looks cooler with a little wear on it. I threw away any notions of keeping this thing pristine as a collector's piece when I had the slide milled in the first place. Perhaps now that I have a holster, the rate of wear will slow down, and maybe in a decade it'll have lost enough for me to be concerned, but that's a problem for the 2030s. Just something to be aware of if such things concern you. I guess it would be negligent to ignore the subject of suppressors entirely, considering what gun we're talking about. The short version is it just doesn't work with my purposes here, which has been procuring the most effective gun I can conceal. I cannot conceal a suppressed Mark 23. I don't think anyone can conceal a Mark 23 unless he has a shoulder rig with the muzzle facing straight down and a long coat over it. And the weather here just doesn't permit that outside of maybe 1 week a year. On top of that, my defensive ammo is supersonic at 1100 feet per second, which eliminates the biggest inherent advantage of suppressing a 45. If you can get the explosion down, then there's no sonic crack, and then it's really, really quiet. So, yeah, don't get me wrong, it would be super cool, and I may do it one day, but it will be for fun, not this thing that I'm talking about here making a video about. With all this, my Mark 23 has gone way beyond just my everyday carry gun. This is my all-day, everyday gun. Aside from being on my hip, it floats between my bedside table as I sleep, my keyboard as I chill at home, my daily backpacks holster, and more. My phone is probably the only other possession that possibly competes with this in terms of a constant presence in my life, and that's basically just because I can't work out with this while carrying it. I heartily recommend it. If your heart is drawn to this, it can work. I hope this was helpful to you, to anyone interested in this. Thank you all for your attention and consideration. May God bless you all, and have a wonderful day.